do have something special to do with you for the 4th of July. And I've thought about how to frame it a few different ways, and I've decided to go with the question, is it too late to redeem the spirit of 1776, 250 years later? And so I notice, and by the way, it's apparent on the National Mall. It's apparent in a whole bunch of survey data, and there's something sometimes called the zeitgeist, right? The spirit of the times. I was there in right 1976. I think many of us were for the bicentennial. I remember the spirit of the country. I remember the
Can I
patriotism,
have some water?
despite the fact that we had right the hangover of Watergate, of the Vietnam War, that we were still experiencing stagflation. I do think there was a deep confidence, although we have our problems, our country is on the right path. And we have the resources, the resiliency, the collective purpose, and the shared history with the resources that it provides to handle the difficulties we're encountering. That's my memory of 1976. That's what I get as someone who does a fair bit of political history in the sense that the progress we had made in the middle of the 20th century, the victories in the world wars, the conquering and coming together around the Great Depression, and then the following progress with the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, other social movements, gave us sufficient hope to think that the project we were embarked on together was, all things considered, a success, present difficulties notwithstanding. And my sense of the zeitgeist 50 years later of 2026 is there is very little of that confidence left, and that the bluster of the current president of the United States is a desperate effort to try to breathe that confidence back into us. But he doesn't have the wherewithal to actually return to the resources that gave us that confidence. And therefore, it falls to us. And I am glad to hear that you are celebrating the 4th of July today. I think we should all be celebrating it, not with the spectacle in the National Mall or cage fights. You know, we don't need violence or glory or chest pounding. We need reflection and reflection both on what our anchoring values are and on how we're falling short of them in order to then pose the question, how might we do better for the next 50 years, let us say, so that when we get to our tricentennial, it will be a more unambiguously celebratory occasion. I have a cover right from the New Yorker, which I thought captured this very well, red, white, and kind of blue by Barry I'm sorry, Blitt, and I think there's a little bit of an echo of the Coltrane kind of Blue Album. Obviously, Washington is not playing the trumpet, but certainly looks the part of a kind of blue man. But I also wanted to share again Jasper Johns, this time the Three Flags version of his many paintings of the flags, and the layering here, I think, gets at something, which is that the United States did not come into being full-fledged in 1776 or 1789. In many ways, we were deeply deficient in our ability to live up to our founding creed, and that over the course of centuries, we rededicated ourselves again and again to that project. And so that the time is ripe. It is overdue for us to think again about what fidelity to the project of defending the proposition that all men are equal, that we have certain rights, and that government is instituted to protect those rights and to do our bidding, our collective work for us. So I start with a little bit more of an objective measure, right? Looking at various polls, the Gallup poll, the World Value System poll, survey poll gives us clear evidence, right, that if we look at roughly the period from the bicentennial to the 250th anniversary, we are in a period of sustained decline in confidence and pride in our institutions. It is not evenly distributed. It's polarized like so much else. Democrats in particular have seen waning, right, pride in being American. And please note, right, that when we start this diagram, Democrats were almost as proud as Republicans during a Republican administration. And we get to the bottom, right, of the diagram. And it is the case that we are now more polarized, but it is also the case that Democrats, who are, right, still the majority party, are less confident in America. And by the way, we used to be much more proud of our country than almost any other country in the world, certainly than the Europeans. And it's one measure that we are now less proud on average of our country than the Europeans are of their country. So I now want to start with the document, right, that we are celebrating today, right? There's a reason we celebrate the 4th of July, and that is because this is the day on which the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. And I think it is worthwhile to recognize this is probably the most famous document of the period we call the Enlightenment. It distills not only its spirits, but its most important claim. And so I want to share with you a little bit more than sometimes we share. And I want to note there's a long tradition in the history of the United States of the president reading the Declaration on the 4th of July. Donald Trump has never done that. And so maybe we can do a little bit of this together. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. I'll say very briefly, I've read this document hundreds of times over the course of teaching about the revolution or American institutions, and it never ceases to give me chills. It is such a profoundly important expression of a political ideal. But I want to do more than that, right? I don't think we can just celebrate this document today. I think we also have to ask the question, has our form of government become destructive of the ends for which it was instituted? That is fidelity to the Declaration, to recognize that it's not just a celebration, it is a critical standard that we need to use to judge ourselves. So let me begin the judgment. And I start with the idea that our institutions fall so short of the promise, right? The promise that our government will be accountable to us, that it will promote our life, liberty, and our pursuit of happiness. This is, right, reflected in the dysfunction in Congress, which is right, incredibly paralyzed and inactive. So starting with approval ratings, right? Note that although it spiked around September 11th, if you were to do the average of the 25 years from 1976 to the turn of the century, that average approval rating would be probably around 40%. If you were to do the average from the next 25 years, it's literally half of that, around 20%, and currently at 12%. And there's a reason, right? The Congress of the United States has become a less productive institution. And in particular, if we look at its major bipartisan legislative acts, I think what we see is that in that first 25-year period, or going a little bit back further, it was legislating in ways that clearly responded to and improved the situation of the citizens of the United States, creating the interstate highway systems, passing the Civil Rights Act, Medicaid and Medicare, the Clean Air Act. And then beginning with the Reagan tax cuts, we get to a period where, frankly, almost every major bill of the last 25 years is a reaction to a crisis, right? So we get the Patriot Act, the financial crisis bailout, COVID aid. The one exception to this is the Affordable Care Act. And please note that Congress, right, with the one big beautiful bill, just removed the subsidies. And the result is, according to a recent Kaiser Family Foundation poll, that 50% of Americans have medical needs that they cannot afford to pay. And so in many ways, right, we go from a period where Congress is doing the people's work to a period where Congress appears to be working for somebody else besides the American people. And it's not hard to know who that is. This is the most recent version of this document prepared by Adam Bonica at Stanford. The top 0.01% of Americans in the 2024 election outspent in that election 99.99% of us, right? Electioneering has become a tremendously expensive affair. That money is not coming primarily from the parties. It is coming from dark money, from unaccountable contributions from political action committees, super PACs, right? And the result is that our legislature is not responsive to ordinary citizens. There's no detectable responsiveness in the most sophisticated study that has been done of this. And as opposed to that, they are deeply responsive to the people to whom they owe their political careers, the hyper wealthy and the interest groups and the political action committees. They fund. The most recent version of this, of course, is crypto and AI, ponying up hundreds of millions of dollars for the primaries of a midterm election. So, right, we have a system of government that has turned much more into an oligarchy, away from being a democracy. We need to think about the structural roots of this. How did this happen? I will say that part of the problem is Citizens United, and that reflects a different structural problem, how much power we give to unelected, unaccountable justices to invalidate the will of the people. And please note, very broad popular support for campaign finance regulation. Again, just this week, the Supreme Court dismantled more of it. It's almost all gone. But I want to say it's structural. It has to do not only with the fact that we give all that power to the Supreme Court, but that we have concentrated democracy almost exclusively in electioneering and made it an extremely expensive and poor instrument for democratic accountability. Second problem here, right? And again, this reflects problems with our institutions. That the fact is that we're in a period of partisan parity, where the two parties alternate back and forth between control of Congress. We hope the Democrats are going to take control back in 2026. But the institutions that we have don't function very well when power is roughly evenly split between the two parties. It changes the incentive structures for the parties and the members of Congress away from governance and toward winning a transient majority in the legislature. And so very quickly, we're working especially with our system of Congress with an 18th century constitution. Our founders did not anticipate that we would have parties, let alone that we would become a country of 340 million people with huge congressional districts and very sophisticated professionals managing the campaigns over mass and increasingly digital media. This is not working in the 21st century. This system is not constituted to produce accountable, responsive government. I think we need to recognize that. I turn now to the second of the three branches of our federal government, the Supreme Court, and I want to say that it is losing its legitimacy. And the data on this are absolutely clear, right? The majority of Americans do not approve of the Supreme Court. They had a highly favorable rating at the beginning of the period we're talking about, and they have squandered that favorability. And this is another polarized issue. Republicans are more happy with the Supreme Court than Democrats are, and that is frankly because it has become an increasingly partisan institution where, right, the justices vote predictably along the lines of the party that appointed them. Not uniformly. Obviously, we got big decisions this term on tariffs and on birthright citizenship that went against Donald Trump. But frankly, what he was doing was so explicitly and blatantly anti-constitutional. And yet, right, we came very close to losing these decisions. 29 out of 30 of the 6-3 decisions had the liberal justices voting the same way. This is not operating as a forum of principle, but as a partisan institution. Given its composition, it is essentially the judicial branch of the Republican Party, and that is not what we want our court to be, right? And so very quickly, the court has become anti-democratic. I'll start with the idea that the conservative majority, which was purchased by the Federalist Society following on the Powell Memorandum for at least $500 million. And I think in light of what the court has done recently, they can't see that as anything but a good investment. And it is a problem, right? When the most functional institution in our federal system is a 9-person body where the justices serve effectively for life and are unaccountable. That's where the heart of power is. And by the way, they are using that power radically in a maximalist way, right? I think we've got to return to Louisiana versus Caillet and the way in which they disregard the explicit language of the 14th Amendment, which says Congress has the right to enforce the amendment, and yet, right, they override Congress's legislation to enforce the 14th Amendment's protection of equal rights for citizens. It is a regressive Supreme Court. And I think it's increasingly clear it will take the constitutional law of the United States in many important respects back to the beginning of the 20th century, back over 100 years ago. And it is destabilizing our law. And this has only been accelerated by the Trump appointees and by Trump's second term. I don't think this is going to get anything but worse. So they have embraced an originalist and textualist approach to constitutional interpretation and statutory construction when it serves their purposes. They're highly selective and inconsistent in doing this, but I want to be as clear as possible. These approaches sever both constitutional and ordinary law from us, the sovereign people, and from our representatives in Congress. The Supreme Court is claiming power to override the stable majority of Americans' opinion about what their Constitution means, to invalidate legislation that has broad support, and to take us backwards in time. This is an anti-democratic court. I don't think that the institution of the Supreme Court as such is necessarily anti-democratic, but the way in which it's been captured, and also the way in which it is institutionalized in our Constitution and in our law, invites this kind of capture. Again, we need to start rethinking how to do judicial review, constitutional law in the 21st century. They have decided just this last term a number of highly consequential voting rights, immigration, executive power, and equality cases. And in all of these cases, they've arrogated authority to themselves from the other branches. They've limited access to the courts to enforce rights. They've empowered Trump's administration as it becomes increasingly autocratic. And they've revealed a partisan decision-making process that is more important to them than fidelity to the Constitution or the law. I focus for a moment on Louisiana and Caillet and Trump versus Slaughter to point out, right, that they have dismantled the Voting Rights Act, and with it permitted unrestrained gerrymandering that is going to be directly hostile to the principle of one person, one vote, and therefore hostile to equality and democracy. In Trump v. Slaughter, Stephen Vladeck, I think, put it best. They've detonated a nuclear bomb in the middle of the administrative state. And please note that that state, right, that structure, I've called it before grafting an administrative state, a 20th century set of independent expert agencies into an 18th century constitution. It's a piece of constitutional creativity. I think we have to own that. But it has been sanctioned by Congress, by presidents, and by the courts for a century. And at the stroke of a pen, the drop of a gavel, they have undone what Congress, presidents, and courts have agreed was the best way to use our Constitution and to create a structure that Americans rely on for safety and order in a complex and uncertain society. And by the way, in so doing, they will further undermine confidence in our government. And so I will put it simply, right? And right, the line, I think it's Sotomayor, comes back. People will die as a result of these decisions. This does not protect life. This does not protect liberty. This does not protect the pursuit of happiness. Our governmental structure is no longer conducive to the ends for which it is instituted. We need to reclaim our constituent power to remake it. Finally, just for a moment, right, life, equality, remember that this is also a court that overturned the right to abortion. This is what extreme partisan gerrymandering looks like. Pennsylvania 2012. This is what the court struck down but will now permit, right? And the idea that Democrats won the majority of the votes for Congress but got only a little bit more than a quarter of the representation. The Republicans got 49% of the vote and 72% of the representation. If you were a Republican in Pennsylvania in 2012, your vote was worth 3 times as much as a Democrat's vote because the Republican Party had cut up the electoral map to amplify the minority power of its vote. That is not democracy, but that is now what the Supreme Court permits. And by the way, right, if you want to think in terms of equal inclusion, rights, suffrage, and representation of all persons as a basic prerequisite for democracy, we really only became a democracy after the Voting Rights Act. And by the way, the gutting of the Voting Rights Act is almost certain to eliminate a large portion of African American representation in Congress. It's not that the representatives won't have the votes, it's that the districts will be constituted to dilute, to break up, to crack those votes so that those representatives will not be returned to Congress. When we look at the attack on the administrative state, these are all the boards on the administrative agencies that the Slaughter decision now allows the president, under the theory of the unitary executive, to unilaterally and at will, without cause, dismantle, right? And please note, both in terms of the funding and the amount of code, much of the action in the making, enforcing, interpreting of law in the 20th century and into the 21st century has been in the administrative state. The unitary executive theory on which this decision relies is both, on the one hand, deeply at odds with any kind of originalism, right? That the spirit of the founding was one of mistrust of executive unilateralism, but also deeply at odds with what the American people want from their Constitution and their government, which is competent and expert and nonpartisan regulation. The effect of this, right, decision will be that any time an anti-regulatory president is elected, at more or less the sweep of a pen, he will be able to appoint commissions that will dismantle regulation. And I'll just say this very quickly, right? Regulation takes a lot more time to develop and promulgate than it does to dismantle. And so the gist of this is not just to give presidents more power over agencies that are designed by Congress to be independent of unilateral presidential control, but also to be deeply hostile to the administrative state. And then we just need to remember, right, in a century where, right, the Republicans have won the popular vote for the presidency only twice, they nevertheless have had a consistent and strong majority on the Supreme Court. And this means that this institution no longer is populated by the people's principles, by those who are sensitive to or consider it their mission to interpret the Constitution in the way that we, the people, intend it, as opposed to that, right? This is an institution of minoritarianism, of anti-democracy. I still love Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson and her formulation of the idea that the use of originalism is a form of Calvin Ball jurisprudence, right? Calvin Ball is the idea that there are no fixed rules. You make them up as you go along. By the way, that is deeply hostile to judicial behavior or norms and to the rule of law. But Ketanji Brown Jackson adds, we seem to have two rules. The one that there are no fixed rules, and the other that this administration, I'm going to modify it, almost always wins. So turning finally to the presidency. And here I will say very quickly that you don't find the kind of polling that shows the overall legitimacy of the institution in the way that you do with Congress and the courts, because of course the presidency really is identified with the person occupying that office at the time. It's more the president, but we will note just in passing that Donald Trump has the lowest approval rating of any president in the history of modern polling, and that there is, generally speaking, a downward trend in approvals ratings of presidents. But I want to focus really on Donald Trump. For a moment, let me start with the idea that Congress actually did something that it's supposed to do regularly in a highly exceptional way last week. It passed major legislation that the people of the United States want, that had bipartisan support and bipartisan ideas embodied in it. I'm talking about the affordable housing legislation that Donald Trump has refused to sign. And so I'll just note this very quickly, right? This diagram shows the number of veto players in a system of government, and the idea that when you have a lot of veto players, to get anything done, you need something close to consensus, and therefore decision making is difficult. The United States is really the system of government with the most veto points, and therefore in which legislation is the most easy to block. And in our recent history, it has been blocked a lot. Donald Trump's blocking of this legislation is just the most recent indication of this. But why did Donald Trump not sign a bill that his own party is deeply desperate to campaign on in 2026? Because he's holding it hostage in order to pass another bill, the Save America Act, which is a voting suppression act. To be as clear as possible, the Heritage Foundation says there is statistically undetectable voting fraud in the United States in recent history, right? We don't have a problem. But this bill, in order to remedy a non-existent problem, would take tens of millions of Americans and put them in a position where they'd almost certainly be disenfranchised. And there's a clear partisan split in who would be disenfranchised. It's mainly Democrats, mainly urban dwellers, mainly people of color. Donald Trump says, right, that the Republicans would never lose an election again if this bill were passed. And I think what he means, right, is Democrats only win because we engage in fraud. That is manifestly disinformation, the worst kind of political lie, because it not only props up your party by circulating mistruth, but undermines confidence in the election. But having said that, right, the idea that he is going to no doubt use this excuse if the Republicans lose representation in Congress in 2026. And then let us note, right, the legislation he's holding hostage, that the Republican Party is desperate for him to pass, is legislation that addresses an affordability crisis in the United States. And at the same time that he's saying that legislation is a yawn, he doesn't care about it, he's also saying he doesn't care about inflation, that he doesn't think the numbers are bad. And by the way, they are bad, 4.2% when we already have an affordability crisis, and they are caused by the president's choices, by his war of choice in Iran and what that has done to gas prices, by his tariffs. And, right, please note, at the same time that he's saying he doesn't care about inflation that his policies are causing, we learn that he's made $2.2 billion over the first year of his second term. I want to say this as clearly as possible. This is a president who does not seem to care about whether or not his policies are either supported supported by the American people or actually conducive to our essential interests. This is a president behaving more like an autocrat than a Democrat. And by the way, in his first year in office, he did more to build the institutions of a police state in the federal government of the United States and under his executive branch, aided and abetted by the Supreme Court on both the shadow docket and the merits docket, than dared the leaders of Hungary, Venezuela, Russia, or Turkey as those countries slid into autocracy. I don't think, right, it's obvious we're not all the way there. I think we're beginning to find our capacity to push back, but please note the danger, right? The danger in the presidential system enabled by the Supreme Court, but the imperial presidency with all of the power that it concentrates is a deep danger to our life, liberty, happiness, and equal rights. It's time to recognize this institutional structure doesn't work in the way that it's supposed to. By the way, the limitless energy and abuse of his office's powers to undermine the forthcoming elections. I won't go into all of the ways he's doing it. I'll just point to the just tremendous disrespect for the American people that his effort to defraud us of $1.776 billion, note the cuteness about it, right? To fund a slush fund, to probably fund election interference, right? This is where we are. It's no wonder, right, that most Americans have lost trust in governance. But I want to just note for a second that it's not just that our government isn't functioning or that it's encroaching on our liberties. It is that our well-being is suffering. A government that does not listen to us, that does not respond to us, does not protect our essential interests, does not help us to manage the transition into a very different and frankly much more precarious and risk-laden kind of society. And so when Americans are surveyed about what they think the most important issue is in our world, they say the economy first, and they then add very quickly polarization, the Republican Party, the state of democracy, the Democratic Party. Please note that both parties have very high unfavorability ratings. And you add all of this together, and by far and away, the most pressing problem in the United States today, as far as the majority of Americans are concerned, is our politics. And by the way, nearly 2/3 of us think we are too divided or polarized to fix our problems. And just to bring the picture into completion, if we start looking at other institutions, right, political parties, and political parties that are supposed to be, on the one hand, an instrument for transmitting our ideas to the people who would like to represent us, and on the other hand, socializing our would-be leaders to internalize the values and norms that are the guardrails of the rule of law, of our rights and our democracy. These institutions have been hollowed out from within. They have become mere vehicles for donors to funnel money to would-be leaders, and not anyway effective two-way conduits of communication between the represented and the representors. So when we shift to thinking about the voters, we've become highly disorganized and individualized. We're not active in civil society, either in non-political associations or in social movements. And our society has become so unequal that in our disorganized state, without unions, without social movements, without clubs that allow us to form trust and begin to work together, we're just not in a position to constitute countervailing powers and to prevent the oligarchs who are rising from using their highly concentrated economic power to dominate our politics. Sorry. When we look at who does have power in this system, donors and advisors in campaigns and the media. And here I would note that a substantial ecosystem within our media system has become what, right? Yeah, I've been relying, by the way, on Daniel Schlossman's recent work on political parties and Yeshai Benkler, and this is co-authored work. I'm just citing the lead author's work on network propaganda. His claim that right-wing media in the age of digital and social media has simply become a propaganda feedback loop. It looks not for verifiable, relevant, educative content, but simply for viral content. And for content that is highly popular and identity confirming for its relatively narrow slice of the viewership. And when I say relatively narrow, 30-40% of Americans, but they're not trying to broadcast. They're narrowcasting. They're not trying to confirm the truth, the reliability, the relevance of what they're broadcasting. All they're looking for is content that will keep eyes on screens. And the result is that the Republican Party, having lost power to the right-wing media system, cannot tell the truth in the 21st century. And our political system cannot serve our interest. The challenges are mounting. Income distribution has become considerably more regressive since the bicentennial. Wealth distribution even more glaringly oligarchic. Our racial composition, our gender roles, our sexuality, our religiosity are all transforming rapidly. We need responsive government in these kinds of circumstances, and our institutions do not work for us anymore. The result is large portions, roughly 50% of our population, have seen downward mobility, growing precariousness. They're giving up on the American dream of prosperity. They're giving up on the idea that the democratic system produces accountability and legislation that serves their interests. They're increasingly blaming the diversity of our society for these problems. That is obviously bait and switch. The problems are not to do with a newly diverse America. The problems are to do with the oligarchic capture of our institutions. But as long as we are desirous of, as long as we are, right, in a sense, constituted to look for someone to blame and not a structural force, well, blaming immigrants, blaming the woke elite works very well. I'm now going to, having finished, if you will, the bill of particulars part of today's class. And please note, right, that when the Declaration of Independence was published, most people glossed over very quickly the words that we pay most attention to today and spent most of their time on that list of complaints, what I'm calling the Bill of Particulars, because they were justifying a revolution. They wanted to make up their minds. Is what the king did bad enough? Well, here's the list of things for me to risk my life in order to protect myself from dysfunctional or despotic government. And by the way, that document persuaded most of us, and the revolution was successful. But we can now return to the language of the general statement of principle. And here I just want to note very quickly that this is characteristic of revolutionary rhetoric, that it makes claims, bold, normative assertions that all men are created equal, that we all have unalienable rights, that we are all able to demand that our government respond to our interests, that we have the power to remake our government if it doesn't. Those ideas become part of our culture and become enshrined in our institutions, but they're very hard, perhaps even impossible, to fully institutionalize, certainly in a complex capitalistic society. But they nevertheless become part of how we understand ourselves, our society, each other, and the result is tension, right? We have an ideal. We should be fully empowered to demand accountability from our government, and yet, obviously, that does not happen. And when that tension is not too great, and when we experience progress in the direction of reducing that tension. Here I want to talk again about 1976. Though we were experiencing difficulties, I think we had experienced progress over the previous 50 years at better institutionalizing the promise of the Declaration of Independence, the promise of other public proclamations and our institutions, that we felt we could rise to the challenges of the moment. But when that, right, is too steep, when the disjunction between what our culture, our institutions, our public proclamations promise and what our institutional structure actually delivers becomes glaringly contradictory, it supports a politics of frustration, of grievance, of disillusionment, of skepticism, and this drives, in the wrong circumstances, distrust in democracy and a politics of scapegoating. That's where we are now, and we should not expect this to get better. Even once Donald Trump is fully discredited and off the political scene, we will have the same structural problems. To put it very directly, in the words of Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, this is how democracies die. And we are increasingly in the circumstances of a tyranny of the minority. The conservative parties in democracies are the most important predictor of democratic success or collapse. When they support democracy, even when they lose, you get stable democracy like the United Kingdom had over the course of its transition into democracy. When conservative parties turn against democracy, if they lose elections, you get something more like Italy, a long, steep descent into fascism or autocracy. And by the way, the Conservative Party in the United States, the Republican Party, is both showing all of the hallmarks of a weak party and increasingly anti-democratic and opposed to ethnic minority rights, and much more so than, frankly, any mainstream party in the democratic world today. And of course, right now, that party has complete control over the main branches of our federal government. So it has become a radical, populist, anti-institutionalist, minoritarian party we need to recognize. That's not because Donald Trump is a political opportunist. He saw the opening that the failure of our institutions create for this kind of populism. Please note that this is a global trend, right? That in the world of democratic politics, whereas at the beginning of the 20th century, nearly half the world lived in societies that were undergoing democratic transitions. Today, that's reduced by more than half, and the ascendant trend, the kind of government that incorporates most people in the world, is led by populists who are undermining liberal democracy. Donald Trump is a symptom and a accelerant of those trends. He is not the origin of them. And this creates a deep dilemma for us because in these circumstances, liberal and progressive parties like the Democrats tend to become conservative, right? In the sense that they stand up for and defend the institutions that are received, institutions that are under attack by populists. And I'll just note, right, that populism on the one hand has the advantage of saying about deeply damaged and dysfunctional institutions, they don't work and you should give up on them. They're rigged and you should be angry at the people who defend them. But populism promises to repair them and to restore accountability and functionality in ways that are obviously inadequate and engage in scapegoating, in authoritarianism, and just don't work, right? And so we'll go back and forth between populists who better capture the mood, and disillusionment with populists because they don't deliver what they promise. But also, as long as the progressive alternative does not have credible approaches to reforming our institutions and restoring their functionality, accountability, responsiveness, then frankly, we're stuck in this democratic dilemma. And we see it, right? The disapproval rating of the Democratic Party is comparable to the disapproval rating of the Republican Party. Most Americans think our economic system is unfair. Most Americans think our economic and political system needs to be torn down or subject to major changes. How can a progressive party, on the one hand, resist the populist, autocratic dismantling of checks and balances of the rule of law of rights, and on the other hand say, we too believe these institutions are broken and need to be repaired? That is the challenge of restoring the spirit of 1776 in 2026. This leads me back then to the Declaration of Independence. And I'm going to just do a little bit with the text here for a moment. I won't read it out to you again, but I'll note that it starts from saying, right, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands that have connected it with another, that, right, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. The idea that this is an argument, and it's an argument addressed against or to the people who are going to disagree with us, right? This is addressed to the British public, saying, you should recognize that if you were us, you would be doing what we are doing. That it's a document that therefore expresses faith in democratic public argument. It then moves on to talk about, as we have noted, the idea that all men are created equal, that there are certain rights that cannot be alienated, including life, liberty, and happiness, that government serves those ends, and that when it fails to serve those ends and instead begins to abuse them, right, it is the right, their right, the people's right, and it is their duty to throw off such a government and to provide new guards for their future security. I'm not going to go through all of the language here. I know we're running short on time, but the idea that this is a declaration of truths that can be defended by a people who is united in core beliefs, even if they're deeply divided by really important issues like slavery or how to institutionalize government, that they believe that those fundamental rights include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that they want governments to secure those rights, that they believe that government gets its power from the consent of the governed, and that we have a right to abolish governments that become destructive or illegitimate and cannot secure our consent. This is the spirit of 1776. Having said that, let me note very quickly that this part of the document was not widely quoted or cited or influential in the 18th century or the first half of the 19th century. It begins to regain its power, its traction, its hold in the middle of the 19th century. And I'm sorry that I didn't put on the board the title of Frederick Douglass's wonderful address of 1853, What to the Negro Was the Meaning of the 4th of July. But this is a brief selection from a long and powerful text. What have I or those I represent to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? I say it with a sad sense of the disparity between us. I am not included within the pale of the glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all the others in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciations of tyrants brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality hollow mockery. I'll stop there, right? But I just want you to note what Frederick Douglass is doing. He's returning to the Declaration of Independence. He's indicating what it promises, and then he's using it as a critical standard by which to judge the actual practice of the country. We are long overdue for returning to the spirit of 1776. And I don't think, you can account for the kind of country we are today without noting that Douglass inspires Lincoln to return to the Declaration of Independence. The force of 7 years ago, when you do the math from 1863, is to relocate the founding of the country, which at the time Lincoln spoke was generally considered to be 1789, the drafting of the Constitution. To relocate it to 1776 was to say the fundamental spirit of American Republican experimentation starts with the Declaration and not with the Constitution. So 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty, We made our own Constitution. We didn't just inherit it. That is a fundamentally different kind of political enterprise and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, Lincoln referred to the Civil War as the final battle of the American Revolution. His radical Republican successors referred to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments as a second founding. And so I think they would be deeply disappointed to notice that not too long after this, we returned to racial tyranny in the South. My point in looking at the Jasper's layering of the flags and thinking about the relevance of the Declaration to us today is to say that this work is never finished. Lincoln puts it, I think, in terms we should all return to, We need a new birth of freedom. And it is only if we return to the idea that our country can be again conceived, reconceived in liberty by the people themselves exercising their constituent power. It's only if the spirit of democratic experimentalism that traces back to 1776 is resumed in 2026 that government of the people, by the people, for the people, will not perish. Now, this is the right way in which I want to talk about the relevance of the Declaration 250 years later. I also want to quote to you for a moment a little bit more from Thomas Jefferson. And this is from a letter he wrote later in our in his life. Sorry, I was noticing that I put his picture over the text. Sorry about that. But he has an argument against what I'm going to call constitutional rigidity that supports Douglas's and Lincoln's and our continuation of the spirit of democratic equality and democratic experiment that the Declaration of Independence represents. He says, some men look at constitutions with sanctimonious reverence and deem them like the Ark of the Covenant, too sacred to be touched. They ascribe to the men of the preceding age a wisdom more than human and suppose that what they did to be beyond amendment. I knew that age well. I belonged to it and labored with it. It deserved well of its country. It was very like the present, but without the experience of the present. And 40 years of experience, we can now say 250 years of experience, are worth a century of book reading. Jefferson only had Locke and Montesquieu, James Wilson, and others to draw on. We have 250 years of experience. Our election system is like going to a museum of election systems. We could learn and update. And that's just the start. Let me continue, right? And this, they, the founders, the generation to whom he belongs, would say themselves were they to rise from the dead. I am certainly not an advocate for frequent and untried changes in laws and constitutions. I think moderate imperfections had better be borne with because when once known, we accommodate ourselves to them and find practical means of correcting their ill effects. But I know also that laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As that becomes more developed, more enlightened, as new discoveries are made, new truths disclosed, and manners and opinion change with the change of circumstances, institutions must advance also and keep pace with the times. We might as well require a man to wear still the coat which fitted him when a boy, as civilized society to remain under the regimen of their barbarous ancestors. It is, let me stop there. Each generation is as independent as the one preceding, as that was of all which had gone before it. It has then, like them, a right to choose for itself the form of government it believes most promotive of its own happiness. If they have not, who has? The dead? But the dead have no rights. So this letter, written in 1816, right? So please note, right? 40 years after the Declaration of Independence declares, right, what Douglas and Lincoln, and by the way, Martin Luther King Jr., who in his I Have a Dream speech also quoted the Declaration of Independence, all appreciated. This is a promissory note. This is a kind of commitment that remains counterfactual, but that when used critically as a spur, motivates, inspires, and grounds the projects of subsequent generations to come closer to the ideal that it represents for us. I won't say in great detail what this means today, but let me just conclude for 1 minute by noting how rigid, how hard it has been to amend and update our Constitution. This is one of its problems. How little work we've done to expand our most representative institution, the House of Representatives, which has stayed static for 125 years now in terms of its membership, while our society has grown exponentially. And how poorly our method of electioneering and our organization of congressional districts and elections serve to channel the need for accountable public opinion and will formation if we moved over, for instance, just one possibility, to multi-member districts with some form of proportional representation. We would have many more contested elections, right? We're down to around a dozen seats in the House of Representatives are in fact toss-up seats. That is not a mechanism to produce accountability, and it's also a mechanism that tends to produce extremism. We would have more parties, more accountability, more moderation, more diversity in our legislature if we reformed the way we organize elections. And as I've said to you on many occasions, we need also to reform the Supreme Court. We need to expand it. We need term limits, preferably rotation and panel reform, so that you draw the justices not once and forever, but from all of the federal bench on a rotating basis. But it is also the case that all of what I've just said to you is remedial. It takes the institutional structure of the US Constitution for granted. And I think Jefferson's call, right, for us to have a new Constitution every generation, well, that might be too much. Madison might have a point, but boy, are there some really good ideas for new experimental democracy out there, for much more direct empowerment of ordinary citizens, for using 21st century technology to gather input, to crowdsource ideas, to allow ordinary citizens to be more engaged with the political process and have better channels of input. I won't talk about these ideas today. I know I'm out of time, but boy, the spirit of 2026, if it's going to rise to the challenge of the 250th anniversary of 1776, needs to remember that it's a spirit of democratic experimentation. It's a spirit of thinking again about what it means to bring into the world institutions that allow us to be equal, that allow us to protect our rights, that allow us to express our political ideas in ways that influence our form of government. I'll stop there. Eager to hear your thoughts, your questions. I know I went long. I had a lot to say. Who wants to start us out today? I'll wait a moment. I know I threw a lot at you. I don't know if you have to go to a barbecue or something. I'd be happy to let you go, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I always enjoy being in dialogue with you on these things. I'll just note for a moment that I will come back to some of those proposals for experimentation in future lectures, because I don't want to just tease you with the idea that they're good ideas and here's a whole bunch of books with them. I got a bookcase full of those books behind me. I do want to share some of those ideas with you going forward. Anybody with thoughts about what you want to do with the spirit of 1776 in 2026?
Here comes Flossie.
Oh, go ahead. Oh, okay. So you're calling my attention to Flossie coming back to the computer. Flossie, I hope I didn't steal your thunder. Go ahead. You would have to unmute yourself if you do want to speak. You're still muted, Flossie. You need to press that space bar or the microphone icon.
Thank you. I just loved your performance. I wish you were with me this afternoon.
I would.
Thank you.
Thank you, Flossie. Nothing would make me happier than to be there. Not only because it's 100 degrees in New York City, and I'd much rather be in the climate of the Bay Area, but also because it would be lovely to be able to share this with you in person. David, go ahead. I haven't heard from you for a while. You're going to have to unmute too. David, you've got your hand up, right?
Okay, there we go. I just wanted to say that it seems to me that what's happened in the good eras, like in the 30s through the 70s and the like, is that we've had a sense we've been inspired, we've been informed, and we've been motivated to make the changes and to change the institutions in ways that support the broad largesse of freedom and opportunity and also financial well-being. And that's what we need to do today. And you did a really good job of starting us down that road, David. So for that, we thank you so much.
Thank you, David. I'm going to add one more thing. And so in 1776, right, they didn't just write a declaration. They went to battle, right? That they fought the most powerful state in the world for their freedom. And then in 1860, right, when the Supreme Court got in the way of the effort to constrain slavery to the original Southern states, the people of the United States again went to war, and a horrible war, hundreds of thousands of deaths and casualties, in order to vindicate the principles of 1776. When the freedom riders and the civil rights activists of the 1950s and 1960s went to the South, they faced down state-sanctioned terror, lynchings, killings, beatings in order to stand up for these principles. So yes, we committed to the principles, but we also had the courage, the organization, the right confidence to stand up for the principles in the face of right violence and opposition. And so it does seem to me that part of what we're lacking in 2026 is not just a principled commitment that allows us to further right the cause of organizing equal rights for all, including political rights in our society. We also have become disorganized and frankly complacent. We channel all of our political energies into elections. They're never a sufficient instrument to bring about meaningful social or political reform and change. There's a reason we call it revolution. Thank you, David. Go ahead.
I was just going to say there's one other thing you need to know, and that is many of us are late or almost late for our luncheon appointments. So we do have to rush off to that, and no reflection on any of the inspiring rendition you've given us. So thank you.
And I have to go to a wedding, not Taylor Swift's, I assure you. So I'm going to say goodbye to you. Happy holiday. We'll continue the conversation soon. Bye, everybody. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you, David.
Pleasure as always. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.